Another thing we can do with chords in seconds is we can use them percussively. In other words, we can use them as punctuation. This is kind of useful even in contexts which aren't generally in seconds. For example, let's listen to example 6a. Six A is actually really an example of polyharmony except for the last chord. If you listen to the beginning, you've heard this before in the polyharmony examples from previous lessons. But as an ending, the little percussive chord at the end makes a kind of interruption or punctuation, and often they're quite useful for that. In fact, sometimes you can even, if you need an orchestration to imitate a bass drum but you don't have one, if you do a cluster like that, the double basses, you get a pretty good imitation of a bass drum. Another thing about clusters is, or chords by seconds in general, is that the biggest problem is overly dense harmony. It gets very thick very fast. Okay, so one of the ways, if you don't want to have that kind of overwhelming grayness of effect, another thing you can do is introduce the seconds in the chord one at a time. Let's listen to example 6b. As we can see in 6b, actually we have a cluster chord, then followed by a chord in fourths. There's an interruption, but the cluster chord, instead of being introduced like this, is okay. So here the chord in fourths does pretty much the same thing that the cluster did in the one before. It punctuates. But the point about the cluster here is it's introduced gradually, so the density isn't constant all the time. If seconds are all together, that is to say uninverted, no sevenths, and plotted together, we really call that cluster harmony. It's not just seconds, it's clusters. With cluster harmony, there's no real sense of independent inner parts because the texture is so thick that you can't really hear what's going on in the middle unless you orchestrate one line in the middle with a separate timbre. Let's listen to example 7. As you can see in example 7, okay, there's a sense that the texture is thinner and then thicker, okay? But what you really notice is the general character of the clusters, that is to say diatonic at the beginning, some chromaticism, then back to diatonic, and then very dense at the end. So really it's like you hear an outer part counterpoint filled in very densely. So the sense really is though there's outer parts and a bunch of stuff in the middle, rather than independent parts in the middle, okay? And that's important because if you want to use clusters for any length of time, the big problem is avoiding grayness of texture. So this is a way to do it. By changing the outer parts, it creates a situation where the number of voices in the middle won't be the same because it takes different amounts of seconds to fill in different intervals. So it gives variety of density, and the outer parts still give a certain kind of direction to the whole thing rather than just floating on kind of dead, okay? It's noticeable that in this kind of harmony, since it's so dense, even parallel and direct fifths and octaves in the inner parts don't matter. You just don't notice them. There's so many notes in there and there's so much conflict for the ear. Now those kind of things which in tonal harmony would make themselves noticed, you don't even notice them here. If you write a phrase, let's say with a bunch of clusters, let's say a larger phrase, full clusters if you want, usually the variety will come, as I said, partly from the outer part counterpoint and also from varying the kind of clusters. Let's listen to example 8. In example 8, we have basically two hands a little bit far apart, each one with clusters. As we can hear, the last cluster is still the most dense of all, and the outer parts are going contrary motion. So it's sort of like a fattened up two-part counterpoint. The big question or the big problem with clusters is always how do you lighten them up? Here are a few ideas. If you're using cluster harmony for any length of time, you can lighten it up by using instruments with no sustain. For example, the marimba, piano, harp, where you have mostly attack, you don't get the sustain. The sustain is when it gets very dense. If you do sustain, use very soft sounds like muted strings, low flutes. Don't fill in every chromatic second either. You can leave a bit of a hole in the middle sometimes. It lets some air in. And finally, to make a cadence with two-part harmony, you need to make some change of texture and the outer parts, some sort of change in density or lightness at the end. And that pretty much covers it for harmony with seconds and sevenths.